All right, so welcome to the first lecture of the new academic year. And the title of this lecture is The Roots of American Government. Now, this is certainly not going to be the preferred avenue for doing our lectures, but timing-wise, it works out to do this as a video lecture. So you need to download the outline for this lecture from online and under the notes folder, and then use the video, use the information you learned to kind of fill out the different sections. As you'll see, there's an outline there for you with some of the main terms in parentheses and bolded. And these are going to be some of the big concepts that we're discussing not only right now early on, but throughout the year, because these are the main ideas that influence American government. So in terms of this lecture, I want you to think about American government kind of as a tree, right? So we've got this tree, beautiful tree that I'm drawing, right? We've got our government. And it's very tangible. We can see it, we understand there's parts of it, but what we don't see are the roots that come out underneath of the tree, right? It's like, where did this come from? What's underneath of it? And so in this lecture, we're going to talk about four main roots of American government: religious roots, classical roots, English roots, and Enlightenment roots. So each one of those we'll talk about as sort of a different root: religious, classical, English, and Enlightenment. Because our founding fathers were really smart, but they didn't come up with all these ideas themselves. They borrowed these ideas from a lot of other places. So we're going to talk about what are the big ideas that influenced American government and where did they come from. So this kind of gives you the visual of our government having these roots that helped it to grow. So let's start off by talking about religious roots. And normally I'll try to have some visuals and presentation to go along with this, but given that it's just a video lecture, I'm just going to put some of the terms up on the board. So we're starting off with religious roots. And as you see from the outline, the important idea or term that we're going to talk about here is natural laws. So it's important for us to kind of understand the background of our founding fathers. All of them came from what we would call a Judeo-Christian religious tradition, right? England was a Protestant country. Religion has played an important part in the history of England, and when our founding fathers came over here, they brought that with them. And so as part of this Judeo-Christian religious tradition, our founding fathers were really influenced by the belief that people should try their best to create a society that's based on justice, right? Where everybody in the society respects the laws. So this idea of justice, respect for the law, was an important part of this religious root of our government. And for our founding fathers, this religious tradition brought them to believe that laws weren't just about laws made by men. Laws were also about natural law. And that's a really important term that we need to understand. Natural laws. We're used to thinking about laws like there's a speed limit law, right? You can't go faster than this. Or there's a law about, the environment. Those are man-made laws. For our founding fathers, their religious tradition and religious background taught them that there was such a thing as natural laws. And what natural laws means, kind of in short, is this idea that there is a universal set of morals and principles that can be applied to any culture, any country, right? That these are basically God-made laws that apply to all humans. Right? And these laws are more important than man-made laws. So that's pretty abstract. What does that mean more concretely? Well, we see that in our government through the Declaration of Independence, right? Thomas Jefferson brings these ideas into the Declaration of Independence when he says that everybody is entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right? Those are examples of natural laws that everybody should get. And they're more important than man-made laws. So this first root, this religious root, played an important role in helping to establish the idea that citizens have certain rights because of natural law. Right? The government can't take those away. Those are God-made laws, and they're more important than man-made laws. So religious root. Again, if I'm going a little fast, feel free to pause the video. You don't have to do this all in one fell swoop. Pause the video, go back and rewatch parts of the video, or just pause it and come back later. The next root we're going to talk about is classical roots. And when we're talking about classical, we're talking about two main groups, the Greeks and the Romans. Right? Classical, ancient. So for this root, we're talking about ideas that we borrowed from the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. So what did we take away from the Greeks? What did we get from Greece? Well, the main thing that we got from Greece was the idea of direct democracy. Direct democracy. We've heard the term democracy before. We know democracy is referring to rule by the people. But the Greeks came up with this idea of direct democracy, which means that individual citizens got a say in making the decisions, right? In passing the laws. That worked well for Greece because you had all of these little city-states like Athens and Sparta, right? Where people could participate and you didn't have too many, right? Everyone could have a say in the laws. Direct democracy. Along comes ancient Rome, and the Roman Empire was massive, right? It was way too big to have direct democracy, where everybody could participate. So they came up with a different idea. They said, we like democracy, we like letting the people have a say, but we're simply too big. So we are going to come up with a system called representative democracy, or representative government. And the Romans took the Greeks' idea of democracy, the people get to participate, and they said, you're still going to get to participate, but we're going to do it through a representative government. And what that means is the people will elect representatives to go to the government and make the decisions for them. In direct democracy, everyone gets to have a say directly. In a representative government, people elect representatives to go speak for them. So obviously we borrowed that idea. From the Romans, another important idea that we took away is the idea of civic virtue. Right? Civic virtue is simply the idea that you should be willing to serve your country when needed. You should be willing to serve your country when needed. So So for Rome, that might have meant, joining the Roman army, right? Willingly paying your taxes to the Roman emperor, things like that. Now, in terms of our classical roots, these three important ideas that we borrowed from Greece and Rome, how do we see that in our government today? Well, we see it in a number of ways. We certainly see direct democracy and representative government because we get to vote. We get to vote for people to represent us in local government, state government, and the national government. Right? Democracy is a really, really important idea, a concept that influenced us. And we said we want that, right? We want our citizens to have a say. We're too big for direct democracy, so we're going to use representative government, right? And we still get to do that. We've done it for 200 plus years where we get to elect our officials. We get to have a say. We see civic virtue in a number of different ways. Probably the most obvious would be the military, right? People feel that, if the country needs your service, that you would step up and serve in the military. We've seen that in our history through military drafts, but we still see it today from people who join the military out of a sense of civic virtue, out of a sense of duty to your country. For people who are not in the military, a good example of civic virtue would be serving on a jury, right? If you get a summons for jury duty, you would, even though it's kind of a hassle, you would willingly do it because your government, your city, your state, your country needs you to do it. Okay? To a certain extent, I think some people might argue even voting is an example of civic virtue. Okay? That our system only works if people participate. And so you have a duty, a responsibility to vote, to participate. So that idea has certainly influenced us as well. So we've talked about the religious roots. We've talked about the ancient classical roots from Greece and Rome. A couple of important ideas so far. Let's move on to our third root, which come from our parent country, England. We'll talk about some of the roots that we took away from our time as an English colony. Okay? And there's three important terms we're going to talk about here: rule of law, limited government, and individual rights. And for each of these, there's a specific document from England that gave us these ideas. Now, I'm less concerned that you memorize the document. I'm more concerned that you understand what the idea means, because that shows up in our government. So we're going to start off with the idea of rule of law. And we got the idea of rule of law. We borrowed that from England, and it shows up in an important document called the Magna Carta. Probably heard of the Magna Carta before. And what it did, the Magna Carta, was put limits on the king's power. Right? The nobles basically forced King John to sign the Magna Carta saying, you do not get unlimited power. Right? The people have rights as well, and you don't get to have all of the power. So the Magna Carta puts limits on the power of the monarch. And this gave us the idea of rule of law. Simply put, what rule of law means is that nobody is above the law. Not even a king. Nobody's above the law, not even a king. So how do we see rule of law in our government today? Well, in our country, everyone has to follow the same laws, even the president, right? So probably our best analogy to a king would be the president, right? This person with the most power. And in our country, no one is above the law. Everyone follows the same laws. Even the president has to follow the laws, or he can be removed. Okay? So the Magna Carta gives us the idea of a rule of law. The second document from England was the Petition of Right. The Petition of Right established the idea of limited government. This document established that the king's power was not absolute. Even though he had the most power, it was not absolute. Okay? There were limits to what the king could do. Couldn't do anything he wanted. Right? There are limits to what the king can do. So how do we see the idea of limited government at play in our country? We don't have a king, right? Well, we see it in play through our system of three branches, right? Where the different parts of our government are able to block each other to keep any one group from becoming too powerful. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute or so. But we have checks in place to make sure that no one group or one person becomes too powerful. We liked the idea that the government is not all powerful, so we put in ways to make sure that happened. The third big idea that we took away from England came from the English Bill of Rights. And from the English Bill of Rights, we got the principle of individual rights. And that one is pretty straightforward, right? It's the idea that every citizen has rights that cannot arbitrarily be taken away by the government. Say that again. Every citizen has rights that cannot arbitrarily be taken away by the government. It doesn't mean they can't be taken away. Right? For example, if you think about the right to bear arms. Citizens have that right here in America, but it can be restricted. It can be taken away, just not arbitrarily. So we would think it's okay for the government to say, hardened criminals are not allowed to own a gun, buy a gun. But if they said anyone whose last name begins with the letter P is not allowed to own a gun, we would say, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense, right? That violates the idea of individual rights. Okay? That everybody has rights that cannot arbitrarily or just randomly be taken away by the government. So three important concepts. Rule of law, nobody's above the law. Limited government, right? The government's power is not absolute. And individual rights. People have rights that cannot be taken away without a good reason. Okay? This brings us to our fourth and final root that we're going to discuss, the Enlightenments. So, going back, to world history, the Enlightenment was a period of deep thought, new ideas, right? Advances in science, advances in, just human thinking. And a lot of really philosophical ideas coming out during the Enlightenment. So we're going to talk about a couple of Enlightenment thinkers, 4 of them. 2 of them were English thinkers, and 2 of them were French thinkers. The first name that you need to know in terms of English was Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes is important for us to know about because of an idea that he came up with called the social contract. The social contract. And what the social contract means is that there is an unwritten agreement between the people and the ruler. Right? The people give up power to the ruler in exchange for protection. For Thomas Hobbes, that's what the social contract meant. The people give up power to the ruler in exchange for protection. Now, for the next thinker, John Locke, he took the idea of the social contract a little bit farther, and he said, people give up power to the ruler in exchange for protection, and if the ruler fails to protect the people and protect their rights, they can overthrow the ruler. Right? People give up their power in exchange for protection, and if the ruler fails to protect the people's rights, the people can overthrow the ruler. So how do we see that in our government today? Well, we have a way to overthrow the government every 2 years. We just do it peacefully. It's called elections. If we don't think the government is doing its job, we can get rid of it. We can vote in new representatives. Okay? So there's the social contract theory. It came from these English thinkers. The last two we're going to talk about, first is Montesquieu. Make sure I'm spelling his name right. Q-U-I-E-U. That's a handful. Baron de Montesquieu was a French thinker, and from him we got the idea of separation of power. Montesquieu's idea was separation of power, which means that the government should be broken up into different branches to keep power split up, to make sure that no one group became too powerful. Separation of powers. The second French thinker is a guy by the name of Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau developed the idea of popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty is simply the idea that government, to be legitimate, needs to be based on the will of the people. Okay? For government to be legitimate, it needs to be based on the will of the people. So how do we see these two ideas, separation of power and popular sovereignty, at work in our government today? Well, we have three branches of government. We separate power into three different branches: executive, judicial, and legislative. So no one group gets too powerful. We see popular sovereignty, again, through voting. People base their decisions on voting. So go back, rewatch part of this video if you need to fill in your notes. And if you have questions, highlight them, put a star next to them, and we'll talk about them in the next class period.